Hey everybody, welcome. Today we're going to be talking about ways to use flashback to layer interesting texture into your story. And we're also going to be talking about some of the pitfalls that we need to be careful of when we are using flashback. But first, I need to talk about something that's been on my mind a lot the last few weeks. As a book coach and developmental editor, I work with writers all the time who are so smart, so conscientious about delivering a story the best way they can. And I applaud that. I am also all about studying craft, reading and reading and reading, and learning everything we can about dynamic, vibrant storytelling. But here's a concern that I'm feeling more and more. Writers coming to me who have studied the craft, who have gone to the workshops, who are learning so much, and it's fantastic. But it can also cause some paralysis because instead of guidance, instead of inspiration, sometimes if we don't have a discerning eye, that craft advice can start to feel like craft rules. And I am here to remind you, you are writers, you are creatives, you are artists, and you are allowed to break rules. You are allowed to make new rules. The rules that we have when we're talking about technique and craft are suggestions, they're guidelines. It's very helpful to know what generally works and why in order to write a story. But as we get more and more comfortable with those forms, you have an opportunity to break out and create something new and exciting. And I just have to say this because I'm seeing some really good writing get questioned. I'm seeing really good writers feel insecure when they bust through some of the conventions to try something new. And I just don't want to ever see that happen. That's not how exciting new thinking happens. That's not how amazing new literary breakthroughs happen. And your readers deserve your best stuff. And sometimes your best stuff is going to break some of the rules. It's going to break through some of the conventions. So that's just my gentle reminder that yes, study your craft, learn what works and why. Become a structure nerd, nerd out on this stuff. But then once you have that body of knowledge, experiment, explore, and don't be afraid to try new things, even when you're hearing that they may not be quite conventional or what people are expecting. Okay, so that is a perfect segue into my talk about flashbacks. There's a lot of very good advice out there suggesting we use flashbacks very sparingly and very intentionally because it is true, flashbacks pull us out of the moment as readers. It's a risk we take as writers every time we ask our reader to veer off in a new direction. But flashbacks are also amazing ways to add texture and depth and new understanding to inform your primary storyline. So I don't want anybody to shy away from flashbacks if you have a good reason to use them. And today we're going to add a level of complexity to that by showing how to nest a flashback within a flashback. So the reason that I was actually thinking about this question recently was because it came to me from a client in my group coaching program. And I've changed a couple details a little bit to protect her story, but this will give you the general gist of what we were thinking about in terms of nesting flashback. So the question is, I have a chapter that is a flashback of sorts set back in 1997. And within this chapter, I include an additional flashback to an event in 1980. Is it too confusing to present a flashback within a flashback? So the risk is, and we just touched upon this a minute ago, is every time we dip into flashback, we risk confusing the reader. But the good news is there's lots of ways to avoid that. And this is important because I think with this particular question, the writer was thinking, okay, I know that flashback in itself can be cumbersome, and now I want to add this extra layer with a second flashback. Readers don't track the same kinds of craft rules that we are tracking as writers. They just want to make sure they don't get lost. They just want to make sure they understand where they are so they can follow your story clearly. So they are tracking narrative footing. which means that's the only thing you need to worry about. You don't need to worry about how many flashbacks you're using, so much as are they meaningful? Are they necessary? And do they give your reader narrative footing? So let's think about what this particular writer was doing. She has a present timeline, which is the now of the novel, a 1997 chapter, which is we're going to refer to as the primary memory layer, and then a 1980 moment, which is embedded memory. So we call this nested flashback, a flashback nested within another flashback. And if you start looking for it on your bookshelf, you are going to find that this is not such an uncommon technique. And, and it works when several key elements are in place. First off, that inner memory, so the memory that goes back even further, in this case, we're calling it the 1980 memory, when that is brief and very purposeful. In other words, you have figured out in advance why you need this secondary flashback. It is also going to be successful when it is directly reframing the, we'll call it the 1997 moment in this instance. It's the more up-to-date flashback, right? The first flashback in the nest. When it is it's reframing it, we have new understanding about that 1997 moment that we wouldn't have without the 1980 moment. And it is also, as we've talked about, vital that your reader doesn't lose track of where they are. So they never forget that they're still inside a 1997 flashback, but they're getting a little bit more backstory. In other words, your outer scene needs to be the most dominant. And that secondary flashback is just filling in a little bit more nuance, with a little bit more nuance and information. It breaks when, in this instance, your 1980s scene becomes fully immersive, and you've gone so deep into this moment that you're forgetting about that primary flashback, the 1990s scene. It will also fail when there is no clear entry or exit signal. And in fact, any flashback is going to fail without these because that's exactly how we lose the reader. This is where they become confused. And I'm going to give examples in a minute of clear entry and exit signals, but this is super important no matter what kind of flashback work you're doing. Because at that point, when these failures happen, you've really effectively changed the timeline, and your readers are no longer precisely positioned, and they're going to lose their way and not be able to follow things carefully. So the first thing to keep in mind is you want to control that entry point. You need to signal your shift super clearly. Avoid vague entries. We don't want any kind of ambiguity. So an example of this is, she remembered another time. That doesn't justify the insertion of the scene. We don't understand why that is important. Instead, we want precision, something like this. The song on the radio sent her back to the summer in 1980. Now you are naming a movement, and it becomes much more clear to the reader where we're going. It may hint at why we're going there, and it's going to show the significance of a very specific time and place and how it informs that primary flashback that you are exploring. Another thing that's very helpful is to compress that inner secondary flashback. 1980s moment that we're talking about should feel like a sharp moment, something you are inserting very clearly, very briefly. It's not a full relocation to a brand new place where we're going to linger. It needs to be focused on revealing a single detail or event. And we want to think about it in terms of 1 to 2 beats, not a full scene arc. If it needs a full arc, then you might have something really interesting there that deserves its own chapter. So once you have set an entry point, you have given the reader the information they need in that secondary flashback, now it's time to anchor the return. And you'll do this most of the time with some kind of very clear cue that jolts that reader, that jolts your character back into the present time or into the present moment of your primary flashback. So, for example, the cat knocked a glass off her desk, and suddenly she was back in the kitchen. It was 1997 again. Now, that's maybe a little more anchored than you need to be. You don't necessarily want to refer to the year or do anything so obvious as that. I'm trying to illustrate the concept for you in the most clear way possible. But this gives you a sense of what I mean. We're erasing any ambiguity. We are putting the reader exactly where you want them in your story, back to that primary flashback. And it's important that you are maintaining a through line. So that 1997 scene needs a clear objective and tension, and it needs continuity before and after that 1980 insert. And that's really vital. If you dip back to a secondary flashback back to 1980, we can't then suddenly come to 2026 or wherever your main story takes place. We need to come back to 1997 first to tie up any loose ends there, to drive home why you did the 1980 flashback. We tidy all of that up and then return to present day or wherever the bulk of your story takes place. So now we are completely out of the flashback. So if the outer scene pauses and never regains momentum, that entire structure that you're building for your flashback scenes is really going to collapse and not leave readers very satisfied. They're not going to know why that was there. They're not going to necessarily have a grip of the new information you intended them to have. So this is just something that's very important to think about from a structural perspective. So this is a little bit complicated. This is kind of getting into the structure weeds, which is such a fun place to be, but it can be a little confusing. And it can be difficult to know if you have achieved what you wanted to. So I'd like to give writers a diagnostic test that you can use on your manuscript. So after reading your flashback scenes, ask yourself at every point, is it clear what year you're in? Does one moment change into how we understand another? And when we return, does that primary flashback scene move your story forward? If you are answering no to any of these ideas, you will want to revise. And we're going to be talking a little bit about this process in a free workshop that I am offering this Friday, actually, if you're watching this live. I'm going to put a link to it in the comments section. I would love if you would join us. If you are thinking about revision, if you are thinking about issues like this, please come to the webinar. There's going to be lots of great conversation about how to run tests on your manuscript to really understand what is happening. So here's a strategic alternative. If you feel like that secondary flashback is emotionally heavy, super plot relevant, and has multi-beats, in other words, if that secondary flashback is starting to feel like it's got a lot of complexity to it, there's a simple fix. Either streamline it, edit it down, or give it its own chapter. It may be that you've got some really rich material here and it doesn't make sense to scrimp on it. So figure out how to turn that into a primary flashback instead. Second, and maybe give it its own chapter. Secondly, consider pulling it apart into fragments that you seed across the entirety of your story. It doesn't need to come all at once, perhaps, if it has so much complexity. It may not warrant its own chapter. It may not be a significant plot point, but it may have some key details that you want to just seed throughout your story, and that can certainly work well. The bottom line is, yes, you can nest flashbacks. But most of the time, and please keep in mind what I said at the opening of this video, rules can be broken. This is art. There are no hard, fast rules. But typically, it's important not to drift between them because we're going to have some confusion and it's just not going to feel structurally sound. So enter each flashback that you provide with intention. Keep that inner moment tight. Exit decisively and let your outer flashback scene really carry the weight that you are looking for that scene. If the reader always knows where they are going to feel safe, which means your concept is safe. Thanks so much for sticking around. And now I want to just talk a little bit about that free webinar I mentioned earlier. If you are someone who is revising a novel or memoir and you are either in the middle of revision work or you are anticipating being there soon, I have a free webinar this week that I would love for you to check out. In that webinar, I am going to be sharing the tools and techniques that I use as a developmental editor to look at people's manuscripts and efficiently tackle revision goals. So please come. You are going to learn so much. Bring a notebook, bring a pen. There is lots of substance here. And you're also going to hear from other writers who are in the trenches right now doing revision work and learn what they do to get through this process because it's a big one. And the more support we can give each other, the better off we're all going to be. So please join me, grab that link in the comments section.